Alright, so welcome to Quest 7. We are over the hump. Today we're going to be talking about Macbeth. I'm going to take you through the background. When was this play written? Why was it written? What are some of the historical contexts? Here are some things we're going to talk about today. Understand why Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, the historical events and people around it, and give you an idea about the background and the time period. Now, we've already discussed the time period in some sense. We've already talked about the feudal system, we've already talked about the Anglo-Saxons, and we've already talked about the Renaissance. So some of this is going to be review. Here's a question to start us off. Why did Shakespeare write Macbeth? Make your guess now. Got it? If you said B, you are correct. He wrote it for his boss, King James. Shakespeare wrote it to impress and flatter King James I. You may know that Shakespeare used to write plays for Queen Elizabeth I. If you ever saw the movie Shakespeare in Love, he's doing that quite a bit. But eventually she died, and King James of Scotland takes over. And so he was King James VI in Scotland, and now that he's the king of the entire realm, he's King James I. This happened in 1603. When this happens, Shakespeare's troupe changes their name from Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's men. They're trying to impress the boss. A couple facts about King James. King James, while he was a pretty normal guy and a decent king, he did believe in ghosts and witches, for real. Not just that he got scared at night, he thought they were a real force, and he felt that witches plotted against mankind, sort of on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. So if you wanted to impress King James, you probably wanted to mention witches just a bit. Some other things about King James. He was very paranoid. He felt that he wasn't as popular as Queen Elizabeth, and as a result, he was going to be overthrown. That's the reason one of the themes of Macbeth is that bad things happen if you wrong your king. King James was Scottish. Therefore, Macbeth is set in Scotland. King James had a relative way in the past named Banquo, and as a result, in this play, there is going to be a good and noble, honorable character named Banquo, who is said to later have a son who will become a king. So we have Shakespeare writes Macbeth for King James. And as a result, King James pays for Shakespeare and his theater company to keep doing what they're doing. So you really can't blame them. So, that's why Shakespeare wrote it, but how does he come up with Macbeth? Think about it. If you said D, you are correct. He used events in history. Most of Shakespeare's works were not original. Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, all of these are pulled from older stories. Well, Macbeth is no exception. Shakespeare used some existing tales. What did he use? Well, there is a novel, not really a novel, a collection of writing called Holinshed's Chronicles. These were historical accounts, allegedly, of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Macbeth is loosely based on several of these stitched together. In Holinshed's Chronicles, there is a man named Macbeth who kills a man named King Duncan. Macbeth and Banquo kill the king, though Shakespeare changes this in the play. Lady Macbeth had nothing to do with it. In a different story, we have a man named Donwald who, because of his wife, kills the king, King Duff. So what Shakespeare does is he combines these two stories in order to make Macbeth. Now, I know you haven't read Macbeth yet, so this may not mean much to you, but as you go through the story, come back and take a look at this, and you'll just see how Shakespeare was able to change a little bit of history and stitch his story together. So, where and when does Scotland take place? Where and when does Macbeth take place? Well, it takes place in Scotland, and a lot of people don't know where Scotland is. They think Scotland and Ireland are mixed up. So here's a map. We have Scotland. It's actually at the top of the British island. We have England, and we have Wales. These three countries together are what is known as the United Kingdom. Ireland is not part of the United Kingdom. It takes place during the medieval time period. I believe the year 1040 is often used when people are talking about Macbeth. So, what was medieval Scotland like? Well, in the year 1040, we were in the middle of the Anglo-Saxon time period in England. Scotland was similar, but of course slightly different. It did follow feudalism, in which there was a weak government. The king was a first among equals, not the supreme ruler, but still more powerful than others. And thanes ruled the day. You were either a king or a thane, and if that was the case, you got your castle and you had control over all of your land. Clans were very important. It wasn't so much that you were a Scotsman, but that you were a member of a certain group. That was how you defined yourself. It would be like in Pennsylvania if we defined ourselves as Pennsylvanians rather than Americans. It's not really like that, is it? Finally, violence. Lots of kings and rulers were overthrown in Scotland. From the year 1844 to 1057, 17 kings ruled Scotland. 12 of them were killed, presumably by the next king. So, gives you a sense as to what Scotland was like. Now, we've talked about heroes quite a bit throughout the year. Beowulf was our epic hero. King Arthur was our romantic, our chivalric hero. Well, what about Macbeth? He is a tragic hero. You learned about tragic heroes in Julius Caesar and in The Crucible. So what is a tragic hero again? Well, they start from a high place. They have a flaw, usually it's pride. This leads to a downfall and some sort of negative outcome. However, before they reach that outcome, they become aware of their own mistake and perhaps make an attempt to correct it, or perhaps at least apologize. If you don't have that change at the end where you realize your mistake, you're not really a tragic hero, you're just a bad guy. What else did Shakespeare add in? He added in some strange, some insane things. We mentioned King James likes the witches and the ghosts. He added the supernatural to appeal to King James, and he added fate. We're going to be talking a lot about fate in our discussions, but back during Shakespeare's time, this was a big debate among people. Do people have a choice in what they do, or is it left up to the gods? Here's an example of the Shakespearean tragedy plot pyramid. You'll notice it's very similar to the short story plot pyramid, and it actually follows each of the acts. In Act 1, we're going to be introduced to the characters. In Act 2, the tragic hero will make a number of decisions. In Act 3, we are going to see the climax. The hero will make one choice that will define him. In Act 4, things start to fall apart. And in Act 5, because it's a tragedy, we know that everybody dies. And because we know it's a tragic hero, we know that he's going to realize his mistake, but it will be too late. Some other things you want to look for. Asides. This is when the characters turn directly to the audience and speak to them. This is normal. This is called breaking the fourth wall. So every now and then you'll read a line and it's going to seem strange, but be careful. If it says aside next to it, that means that they're talking to the audience at that point. Soliloquies. Because we didn't have narration back then, oftentimes characters talk to themselves. This lets the audience know what's going on in the character's head. To be or not to be is one of the most famous soliloquies out there, and there's a number of great speeches like that in Macbeth. And finally, foreshadowing. You're going to see a number of predictions and prophecies all through the story. This is great for adding suspense for the audience. And of course, if you have suspense and you have the audience knowing something, you also have dramatic irony. This is when we know something the characters don't. Keeps a play really interesting. Well, that's a brief bit of background on Scotland, on Shakespearean tragedies, on the Renaissance period, and on King James I. Hopefully that gives you some context as you listen to or read Macbeth, Act 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Have a great day, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you out there in Quest 7.